Hey guys, this is Coder Jeet, your best friend in programming, and today I'm going to talk about routing in Blazor. Now, routing is a concept that everyone must be familiar with, especially if you're coming from the .NET world, you are coding in .NET, that's something you've definitely heard of before, and in Blazor it's just handled a little bit differently, and I will be talking about it. In this video, we'll be learning the concepts like what is routing, how to create routes in components, and App.razor. This is a very important file. It's the beginning of your Blazor project and it has some routing code. I will be explaining what that code does. Then you've got route parameters, route constraints, and then how to access query string parameters in your Blazor application. And finally, I will be talking about catch-all parameters and how to set them up. So let's get started right away. First, let's talk about what is routing or route. So the route is nothing but the actual address of the page that you're trying to load from your website. So for example, I am on my website right now, my company website, and I've got a lot of different sections. And let's say I want to go to the customer area. So when I click on customer area, a new URL appears in my address bar, and specifically all the portion that is right after my domain name, in this case technicforce.com, that is the route. So here the route is customer login /customer/login. And what you want to be able to do is whenever people type this particular route in the address bar of the browser, they should be able to load this page correctly. And the entire purpose of routing in Blazor is to be able to serve the page that the customers, that the users are looking for. And you have to do some work to make that happen, because unlike some conventional systems of programming like ASP.NET Pages or PHP in the classic version, the page names, the file names do not directly correspond to the address bar URL. Many times you're using frameworks like MVC or other frameworks like Laravel when you're in PHP that would actually obfuscate the exact file that is being served, and instead of maybe serving a file called login, it will serve something totally different based on your own programming structure. So you need to be able to detect which file to serve based on what people have put in the address bar. That is what routing is all about. And now let's talk about how routing works in Blazor. So your Blazor app is actually compiled application. You've got code in here in C# and you are modifying your interface, which is in HTML, with that code, and everything has to work seamlessly. So what .NET does is, what Blazor does is, it's going to compile each component that you have created in a separate class. So when I have this file called login.razor right over here, I have a corresponding login class that is a part of my application, the final assembly that is created. So in reality, there is no separate HTML page. You're not working with HTML and CSS in the classic sense. It's just one complete compiled application. And what you see at the right at the top of this application, in this instance, for example, is the page directive @page user login. So the root of this particular component is user login. And what Blazor is going to do is, it's going to compile that class login.razor into a C# class, into a .NET class, and it will have a root data attribute, a root data information, where it will have user login. And whenever somebody tries to reach user login in the browser, the assembly will look for all the classes that have the user login attribute that are ready to serve user login, and based on what it finds, the closest match, if it finds something, it will be served. In this case, it's gonna be login.razor. So all you need to do routing in Blazor is to just specify this simple attribute at the top of your components, its page, and then the route that follows. So let's do a quick check of the route and see if it actually works. Let's hit the play button. Alright, so the site has loaded. Now let's tie the root that we put in, user login. And here we are. This is the login page. It's working alright. The root that we specified in the page. So now you know why components are so important in Blazor. Every single page that you want to serve is a component and there is no intermediary involved. There is no controller. You don't have any controllers in Blazor. Your request is going to go directly to a component and that component is going to generate its HTML, its CSS based on the code that you've written and serve it right away. Now the components can be nested. This is a very important concept. Every component can be nested. So you can have one component that's a part of another component. So if I have a component that has its own URL like index and I want to serve login as a part of that component, I can actually do that. It won't stop me. I can load up the login component right over here like this and that works perfectly fine too. Or I can go and load up the login page directly too. So this is what component based structure is all about, and you need to really have it clear that each component can represent either a part of a page or the entire page itself. Alright, so next on our list is App.razor, and I have talked about this in my earlier videos, and if you haven't seen my earlier videos, go ahead and watch the other videos on Blazor programming that I have on this channel, and it will help you build comprehensive knowledge. So coming back to this, the app.razor file is the entry point of your Blazor application. Your Blazor app, when it runs in the browser, the first file that is loaded, no matter which URL the customer goes to, the user goes to, is app.razor. And the app.razor file actually defines the framework for your application. It defines where it should go next, and you have some certain very important data in here. For example, the routing code starts actually over here. So you've got the root view with the root data, attribute root data, value over here, and the default layout. So this is where actually your entire routing code fits in. Whenever your application loads up, your user tries to go to a root, Blazor will go to app.razor. It's going to check out the root view, then it will replace this root data value with the root that your customer is trying to access, and then Blazor will try to find the right class, the right component that can serve that page. And layouts are a concept. The next attribute, default layout, I want to talk about that too. Layouts are a concept that have been a part of .NET programming, ASP.NET programming for a little while. So a layout is actually a container page, like a common part of the page, common part of your website that can be on every single URL, every single page that a user might want to access. Things like the header, the footer, the sidebar, the metadata, they should be a part of every single page maybe. And that's what default layout can do. If any component does not specify its own layout, then this layout, the default layout, will be used, and it's just a class name. That's another signal to you to remind you that every single file in here, the Razor file in here, is actually a class. So when you go to views and you look in shared, you will find the main layout.razor file right over here. It is a Razor component which is compiled, which is a class, and you can just refer to this class over here. Now here is the clincher. You can actually change this on a page by page basis. So if in home I wanted to change the main layout in login, I could just use the layout attribute right over here, and I can give it my class name. That will work. So that's how you can change the layout. But if not, then the main layout or any value that you specify in default layout is going to be used as the default layout. Next thing, and this is very interesting, it is a different element called focus on navigate, and again you're passing it the root data with a selector. So what does this do? It's very interesting. Whenever you go to a page on a website, that page will usually start at the top of the page, right? Whenever you're loading a new page, refreshing a page, what happens? The page will load up at the top. But with single page applications, things are a bit different. You're not really pulling a page afresh. The browser is not pulling a page from scratch. It's not reading each and every tag individually, not starting with HTML tag and then going on to body and so on. It's just pulling a part of the page, and it doesn't know where to start showing you the concept or showing you the page. It doesn't know where the top of the page is. And when you use the focus on navigate element and you specify a selector, what's going to happen is whenever a new page or a new component is loaded using the root, Blazor will show you or will scroll to the first element of this type. In this case, what's the element? It's H1. So on every page, if you have an H1 element, Blazor will load up that element at the top. So it will start the scrolling, or it will scroll to the place where at least one H1 element is there. And this is a way to make sure that your pages always load up from the top and never from the bottom. One thing you must remember, if you specify a selector over here like H1, your pages must actually contain a H1 element. If you've specified a selector but you don't have an H1 element in the page, what's going to happen? Blazor will not know what to load, so your scrolling will not work at all. That's why programming is a definite science. Everything you specify, you have to follow through. If you make a promise, you cannot break it, or the software will not work as designed. Or it will work as designed, but the design would be wrong in fact. So if you make a promise that you are going to provide the H1 selector, you got to follow through. You got to make sure that every single page has H1. Next, we have the not found element. And how does this work? So this is again about routing in fact. So your user is trying to go to a route, let's say it's called user login, and you don't have a page or you don't have a component with the page attribute user login. What's going to happen? If you know, in the classic sense, that would have resulted in a 404. But again, this is a single page application. It's an SPA. It's not a regular website where each single page is loaded separately by the browser, right? So you need to tell that application what to do in case the component does not exist or the root does not exist. And here is where you do that. You specify any element, any HTML code, or you can have components too, like you have page title and layout view and other components. You can specify the exact code that you want to show if a particular root is not found. So you can show a nice fancy little page not found error page directing people to other locations on your website, or you can just have generic text over here like what we have right now. But this is important and you must know how to use it correctly. So that's all about App.razor. I have explained every single bit of it and I'm sure you've understood how it works. Let's go to the next topic. The next topic that we're going to talk about is root parameters. So let's get started. Let's discuss for a moment what are parameters. So parameters are actually values that you pass in the URL based on which you can do something on the page. So whether you want to display some content on the page that you want to receive from the URL, or you want to pull some data from your database based on the input you get, you can supply a parameter in the URL. For example, let's suppose we have a page where we pull up the user information. So we can have a URL like user, and then with slash we can follow up with things like the username, or maybe even an ID, user ID like 33 or whatever you have. And that is a parameter that you're passing to the page, which will be retrieved by the page, and based on that there might be some data that can be pulled out. Now in this particular code example that we're going to see, we are not going to use a ID or a name like that. We're just going to take a value in the parameter and we will show it in the email column. Let's try that. The first step to having a parameter in the URL and accepting it on the page is to specify it in your root. So we're gonna specify the parameter, and parameters are specified in curly braces, the parameter names. So let's have a parameter called username, and now if we run the project, we will find that if we try to go to the user login page now, it just won't work. There is nothing at this address, and the reason is now Blazor expects you to provide the username parameter, and if it's not provided, the page will not work. Now that we have specified that we expect a parameter in the URL, we also need to be using it in the code. And to do that, I need to go to the code behind file that I have and create a public string property. So let's call it username. Get set, it's a property. And then you need to decorate it with the parameter attribute. We included the namespace Microsoft ASP.NET Core Components because that's needed. And now if we run it, it should be populated in the username property that we have created. And let's test that. In the preview, we'll have a place where we can just show the parameter. So you can show any property from the code by using the binding. This is one-way binding. The @ symbol is for one-way binding, and use the property name. So in this case, username. So it should display the username when you retrieve it from the URL. Let's try it. Run it again. Here we are, and let's do user login. Have a username, coderjeet. Here we have coderjeet, actually codejeet, on the page, which is retrieved from the parameter. So you now know how URL parameters work and how you can retrieve them in Blazor and use them in code. The next topic is root constraints. Now, root constraints are also something that is related to parameters. It is a way to constrict the acceptable parameters, to limit the kind of parameters that you will accept in your root. Now, let's say you have a parameter where you're expecting a number. Like in our current case, we're trying to get a username. What if it was a user ID? What if it was a number? How would you handle that, and how would you make sure that people are not able to put in anything but a number? That is done using a root constraint. So the format is pretty much simple. This time, instead of username, I'm gonna use user ID, and to specify a constraint, you put the colon and then you specify the name of the constraint, the data type that you want to use. Now, Blazor allows you to use a bunch of data types. You can use a bool, and the symbol for that is bool. You can use a date time. You can specify a date time as a part of your root, and the limiter for that is date time. You can have a decimal number. Make sure that the URL value confirms to a number. You can have a double number, this format. You can have a floating point number. You can have a valid GUID, an integer, or even a long in the parameter. So if you use any of these limiting texts in your root constraint, like this one, Blazor will accept the root as valid only if the parameter is of that data type. Now let's try this and see if it works. But first we'll need to change this to user ID, and in the backend file, in the code, let's change this to the int type and have a user ID. Again, we are using the parameter attribute, which will make sure that the parameter is accepted and mapped to this property. Let's try user login again with a number, this time like 27, and we should see 27 over here. But if we replaced it with a text with string like coderjeet, we would have an error, sorry, there is nothing at this address. So basically people will be able to load this root only if they provide a valid number as the root parameter. So this is about data type root constraints. Now there is another thing that you can do over here. You can make a parameter optional so that when people try to load up your page, they can do so even if they don't specify the parameter. To make it optional, just put a question mark at the end, and then when you run it, you can load up the page without having to specify the parameter. So we should see a default value for the integer type, it's 0. And if we do provide a value, let's say we provide 1, let's see what happens. Now we've got 1. So now you know that parameters can be omitted if you make them optional. You can also make this parameter nullable by making the data type nullable, and now if you provide nothing, the user ID value will be null and nothing will be rendered on the UI. Let's try that. And you can see there is no user ID being displayed now. What if you wanted to provide a default value? Well, you can do that too. To make that happen, we are going to use a page lifecycle event, and there is an event called onInitialize that we can use. Protected override. Here it is, and all we need to do is just compare user ID to null. We'll use the null coalescing operator for that, and then specify a default value. Let's go with 1, and let's see what happens now. Let's load it up without a argument, and you can see that you are getting 1. So this is how you provide a default value to the URL parameter. Okay, so we've covered root constraints and parameters. Now we gotta talk about catch-all parameters. Now this is something that I used to do a lot when I was using ASP.NET MVC, but I was not making SPAs or single page applications back then. You use catch-all parameters to allow the URL to treat anything that follows your root as a part of that root. You can put it in a variable, of course, but it can be anything at all, even a phrase or a sentence. And you will often find content websites like blogs having a hackable URL at the top or a SEO friendly URL at the top, where they show the actual headline in the URL itself. Well, that's what you can create with a catch-all parameter. And all you need to do to make a parameter catch-all is to put a little star sign in front of it. So now user ID is catch-all, and whatever we put in the route is going to be pulled into the user ID variable. But that means we can't have an int anymore. So let's change it. Let's remove this code too, and let's change it to a string. And let's try it now. User login, and then we will write Kodajit rocks. We're gonna even put a space, and you can see you got the text Kodajit rocks here. So that is now a part of the variable, and you can even go really crazy with this. Look at this. So that's what you can do with the catch-all parameter. Of course, you don't want to put spaces and special characters in URLs, but typically you can do this, and this becomes a memorable URL, a SEO friendly URL. Even though I don't see much utility for this in SPAs, out of just making it more understandable for your customers, for your users, it's not really a SEO friendly URL because mostly SPAs are not that easy to read by the search engine. Alright, this concludes our lesson on routing in Blazor, and I hope you enjoyed this lesson as much as I enjoyed creating it, and you will be committing your time to making sure that you master the intricacies of Blazor. I'm gonna be there helping you. Look at my channel for more lessons. I will be creating more lessons as I go on different programming concepts. Now all of my tutorials are made from a programmer to programmer, from a practitioner to practitioner. So I will be talking about real world problems, and I will be giving you real world tips in my lessons. So don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and if you really like the lesson, drop me a comment below. This is your best friend in programming, Kodajit, signing off.